Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring this fascinating piece called Gita for Joyful Living.
Okay.
Specifically, we're looking at verses 9 to 16 from chapter 3.
Yep.
And it explores this whole idea of like proper action. It's like a pathway to joy. We've got a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in.
That sounds good.
So the source kind of sets the scene by, acknowledging this thing that we all experience,
Yeah.
which is this constant kind of fluctuation between happiness and suffering in life,
Yeah.
right? Like even when things seem pretty good, there's this underlying current of unease, almost like a sense that something's just not quite right.
Mm.
Have you noticed that, like in your own life?
Yeah.
It's like even amidst pleasure or
Mm.
success, there's this nagging feeling that something's missing.
That's a great observation. And it's something that the source directly addresses. It suggests that this underlying suffering stems from a lack of self-knowledge.
Hmm.
Now, not just like knowing facts about ourselves, but a deeper understanding of our true nature.
Right. And as we already know, self-knowledge isn't just like another piece of information to acquire,
Yeah.
right? It's this profound shift in our perception, our realization of our true self that transcends, the limitations of the body and mind.
Yeah.
And the source suggests that like the biggest obstacle to this realization
Yeah.
is, you guessed it, attachment.
Exactly. You see, this attachment to desires, outcomes, possessions, even people.
Hmm.
It's like a veil, obscuring our true nature and distorting our perception of reality. It's like looking at the world through a blurry lens. We kind of misinterpret what's truly good and bad for us.
Okay, so how does this attachment actually play out in our lives?
Yeah.
Can you give me like a concrete example of how this leads to suffering?
Think about it this way. Let's say you're really attached to the outcome of a project at work, right? You've poured your heart and soul into it, and you're convinced that its success is going to bring you happiness. But what happens if the project fails?
Right.
Because you've pinned all your hopes on this external outcome. The failure brings a disproportionate amount of suffering. Your sense of self-worth takes a hit, and you might even start questioning your abilities.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So it's not the failure itself that causes the suffering, it's our attachment to the specific outcome.
Precisely. And this applies to all sorts of desires, from material possessions to relationships. When we cling tightly to these things, we set ourselves up for disappointment and
Yeah.
suffering, because ultimately
Yeah.
everything in the external world
Yeah.
is impermanent and subject to change.
So if attachment is the problem, what's the solution? What do we do?
This is where the concept of proper action comes in. Now the source doesn't advocate for withdrawing from the world or becoming passive. Instead, it provides a framework for engaging with life in a way that minimizes suffering and leads to genuine fulfillment.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this framework.
Well, the source breaks down actions into two categories: actions driven by desire, which originate from the mind,
Mm.
and actions driven by duty, which are guided by our intelligence.
So it's not about suppressing our desires completely,
Yeah.
but about understanding their nature and learning to act in a way that doesn't create more suffering.
Exactly. And when it comes to desire-driven actions, the source provides some specific guidelines to help us navigate them in a healthy way.
Like what? What are some of those guidelines?
Well, the first one's pretty straightforward. Avoiding actions stemming from desires that are clearly harmful, like stealing, cheating, or causing harm to others. These are universally recognized as wrong, and engaging in them will inevitably lead to negative consequences.
Right, that makes sense. But what about desires that aren't inherently bad? Like the desire for success or recognition or a fulfilling relationship. How do we navigate those without getting caught in the trap of attachment?
That's where the other guidelines come in. The source emphasizes the importance of moderating even legitimate desires by cultivating gratitude, viewing pleasures as gifts rather than entitlements.
So instead of constantly chasing after more, we can learn to appreciate what we already have.
Exactly. And another key practice is sharing our enjoyment with others. Instead of hoarding pleasurable experiences,
Yeah.
we can multiply the joy by including others and spreading the positivity.
That's a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of clinging tightly to our pleasures, we open our hearts and share the abundance.
Absolutely. And then for desires that remain unfulfilled, the source suggests praying for the strength to withstand the discomfort. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's about building resilience and developing the inner strength to face challenges without being consumed by them.
So it's about accepting that we can't always control external outcomes, but we can control our inner response to them.
Exactly. And finally, the source highlights the importance of regulating actions through planning and schedules. This might sound a bit dry, but it's about bringing conscious awareness to our desires and fulfilling them in a way that aligns with our values and long-term well-being.
Okay, see how that fits in. It's about not letting our desires dictate our actions impulsively,
Mm.
right? Instead, we pause, we reflect, and we choose actions that support our overall goals and aspirations.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where we can fulfill our desires in a way that contributes to our well-being rather than detracting from it.
So even with desire-driven actions, there's a path to engagement that minimizes suffering and supports our journey towards a more fulfilling life. But I'm also really curious about the other category you mentioned,
Yeah.
actions driven by duty. What are those all about?
Ah, yes. These are the actions that stem from our understanding of what's right, what needs to be done, regardless of our personal preferences or desires. They're guided by our intelligence, that inner compass that points us towards actions that contribute to the greater good.
This is where things get really interesting. How do we distinguish between desires and duties?
Hmm.
And how do we know which duties are truly ours to fulfill?
Those are excellent questions. And luckily, the source provides some valuable guidelines for navigating the realm of duty-driven actions as well.
Great. Let's
Yeah.
dive into those because I have a feeling this is where things get really practical.
Absolutely. But before we jump into that, I think it's important to acknowledge that even our intelligence can be clouded by our preconceived notions, biases, and attachments. So, the first guideline is about cultivating a discerning mind, one that can accurately assess what's truly right and what needs to be done.
So it's not enough to simply act on what we think is our duty. We need to develop the clarity and self-awareness to ensure our actions are truly aligned with our highest purpose.
Precisely. And this leads us to the next guideline, which is to perform them without getting fixated on personal rights or rewards. It's about shifting our focus from, what do I get out of this, to what needs to be done.
That's a powerful shift in mindset. It's
Yeah.
about letting go of that sense of entitlement and embracing the inherent value of fulfilling our responsibilities. But honestly, that sounds pretty challenging. How do we actually put that into practice?
It requires cultivating a sense of detachment from the fruits of our actions. It's not about becoming indifferent or apathetic,
Right.
but about recognizing that true fulfillment comes from the act of fulfilling our duty itself, not from any external rewards or recognition.
So it's about finding intrinsic motivation in doing what's right, rather than relying on external validation. That makes sense, but I imagine it takes a lot of practice to truly embody that mindset.
Absolutely. And that's where the next guideline comes in. It reminds us that we may not see the immediate results of our actions.
This reminds me of the saying, we don't always see the impact of our actions, but every action creates a ripple effect.
Exactly. Our actions have consequences that extend far beyond our immediate perception. It's about trusting that by fulfilling our duties with integrity and sincerity, we contribute to a larger web of interconnectedness, even if we can't always see the full impact.
So it's about having faith in the process and the power of right action, even when the results aren't immediately apparent. That's a really encouraging perspective.
It is. And this brings us to a really crucial point, finding inherent purpose in fulfilling our duties. Instead of viewing them as burdens or obligations,
Right.
the source suggests that we can embrace them as opportunities for growth, contribution, and self-discovery.
I love that reframing. Instead of feeling weighed down by responsibilities, we can approach them as opportunities to make a positive difference in the world and in ourselves.
Precisely. And that leads us to the final guideline for duty-driven action, focusing on our own duties and not getting entangled in judging or trying to control the actions of others.
That's an important reminder. It's so easy to get caught up in what others are doing or not doing. But ultimately, our energy is best spent focusing on our own sphere of influence.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that each individual has their own unique path and their own duties to fulfill. Our responsibility is to focus on our own actions and strive to embody the principles of right action in our own lives.
So by embracing these guidelines for both desire-driven and duty-driven actions, we can cultivate a mind that's less prone to suffering and more aligned with our true nature.
Precisely. And, these guidelines are not isolated practices. They actually build upon each other and support the cultivation of a mind that's ready for self-knowledge. It's like weaving a tapestry, thread by thread, creating a foundation for a truly joyful and meaningful life.